Things here. Okay. So it's afternoon for most of us. It's still late morning for some of you out there in Pacific time. So glad everybody was able to get on and join us. This is the expert webinar of the 6-month DiscipleOn learning community. The 10 participants in the learning community have been meeting monthly since September. They will be interacting directly today with our invited expert, Mindy Caliguire. There are another roughly 20 guests with us today. You all are welcome to submit questions. We're going to ask that you do that through the chat feature on the bottom right of your screen. You might try to find that now, and if you have any problems, we can help you find it. So we hope that the technology goes all perfect today. If for some reason the internet, we lose a connection, just stay on and I will get us back on as quickly as possible from our end. So we'll just plan on handling it that way. If it happens, hopefully we won't have any problems at all. I figure if we have a plan, then we won't have a problem. That's good, I'm going with. Mike, I was asking Mike how he got to know Mindy, because I didn't know, and he came to know of Mindy through some of the articles that she was writing in Leadership Journal about spiritual formation in everyday life. And some years later, he ran into her at some different workshops around spiritual formation. Mindy has a PhD, and Mindy, tell me, is that theology or?
No.
what is PhD?
It came out of a story of a time I was being introduced somewhere.
Oh.
And, I had told this story to the guy who was at Asbury Seminary, and he had driven me from the airport the night before this speaking engagement, and he was telling me about this idea of women who get what he called a PhD for putting hubby through.
Oh,
and I had heard that story somewhere. I told him that story the night before the speaking engagement, and then he stood up in front of this whole class, and it was all being video recorded and everything, and told the class that I had a PhD from Dallas Seminary. And I needed to quickly backtrack so as not to misrepresent my credentials. And as it turned out, I was supposed to be teaching An Ordinary Day with Jesus. Some of you may know that curriculum that John Orberg and Ruth Haley Barton had created at Willow Creek. And I said, no, I only have my PhD for putting hubby through. And I'm just an ordinary woman here to talk about an ordinary day with Jesus. And it just went on from there. So, yes, it's a PhD, not D.
I gotcha. I saw that and I was not connecting. I'm glad I asked and you got to tell the story.
Yeah.
A bit
of an embarrassing moment, but we still
Sharon. So after Dallas Seminary, y'all went to Willow Creek Church for an internship, and then off to Boston to plant a church. And after several years of church planting, which was a tough time, where Mindy is so great to share that that was just a really tough time for her, and really feeling like she lost her soul. And they returned to staff on Willow Creek. It was Mindy's recovering her own soul that made her so passionate about the souls of leaders. So she began. She also transitioned to the Willow Creek Association as the executive leader of Reveal. Then when Reveal was purchased by a company called Glue, Mindy came along to Glue. And Mindy, do I have this right that you're working in the area of cross-congregational discipleship with
That sounds cool.
Oh, I see what Mike's saying.
Probably not, but it's cool. I like that idea.
No, you're helping churches do.
I can explain. I can quickly explain it.
You work with lots of churches, not just one. So that's what we're getting.
Well, in my work with soul care, which I consider what we're doing today kind of along those lines, I still work with churches and ministries and events and different conferences. It's just a heart calling of my life. Yeah. One of many voices that speak on these things and care about it, but that's like one dimension of what I do. And it was actually, I was brought back to the Willow Creek Association in 2009 to support their efforts to help churches with transformation. And so Reveal was kind of a piece of that. And another product that we had that was called Engage, and we kind of got out over our skis as the WCA in terms of a tech project to help churches with some sort of way to support discipleship with technology, which can seem like heresy at some level, but was also a constant conversation of how do we leverage what is happening in technology to support God's purposes. Anyway, those kinds of things. And it was through that work that the CEO of the organization, I have now moved to Colorado to be in support of leading what is being built here. That I came to work for GLOO. It's GLOO. I know it's an awkward acronym. Or it's not an acronym. Everyone would think it is. But it really is just a technology platform that's really focused on trying to figure out how to help people that are helping other people grow. So inherently relational, but where is the content dimension of that? How do you leverage all the cool things that tech can do, but never get in the way of the actual relationship that's helping someone else grow? So how do we serve that? We have some really cool partnerships with really large organizations, many of them ministries that you would know. And so I have a variety of roles as needed, trying to support the effort here. So that's why I'm in beautiful Boulder, Colorado right now. Enjoy the snow. Yeah. It's pretty. And if I were on the other side of the building, I would be able to show you a picture of the Caliguires, if any of you are familiar with Boulder. But the view out of our offices is kind of ridiculous. So anyway, that's how I ended up here. And still super involved with Reveal and rebuilding Reveal as a resource for churches onto this delivery mechanism. It used to be on a different automated service through the Willow Creek Association. Now it's been rebuilt here and is back online and helping churches. And then we're figuring out what other resources we could put towards churches kind of in light of Reveal. So anyway, that's a separate topic, but that's what I do.
Great. Thank you, Mindy. Really, really good to have you with us today. And we've been planning this a while, so it's been fun, and it's kind of neat that it's here. So I want to start our time together. Many of you hope you got a chance to read chapter 4 from Mindy's book, Become, and talking about shepherding. And I want to kind of start us off here into our topic with some Lectio Divina, and just give you a time to listen, a time to kind of put what you've been doing today kind of to the side and focus. And so I'm going to read through Psalm 23 once. And if you will, just as I read it slowly, listen to what the Holy Spirit moves to jump out at you. What phrase or what word or what image really calls to you in this. And then I'm going to have Mindy read it the second time, and we'll ask God why God had that jump out to you. So if you want to just kind of get comfortable, I will kind of lead us in. God, we thank you for this time, and we pray that as we read your word, that you would speak to us, that you would help us to focus, to prepare for what you have for us in this time. The Lord is my shepherd. I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Now, as Mindy reads it, consider that phrase again and why. Ask God, why does he want that to jump out to you? What does he want you to hear?
So again, reading from the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd. I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
Amen. Okay. Hope that you had a word from God that you can just kind of jot down and see where that takes you. Mindy, I'm going to give you the floor and ask everyone else to mute, and that way we won't get any background noise. DiscipleOn community, you're welcome to ask questions like you always do. Take your mute off and ask, and I think we'll give Mindy some time to teach, and then we'll have time to ask questions. And those of you who are guests with us today, we're glad you're here, and if you'll use the chat bar to ask questions, we will, Mindy gets to those too. Okay, all right. Thanks, Mindy. I'll let you go.
Great. Thanks, Kathy. And as some of you may know, if you've ever been at an event that I've done or a small workshop, I consider myself highly interruptible, and I would far rather know what you're thinking and what questions you have than to just carry on with something that's not helpful. So when Mike asked me to do a bit of teaching on that chapter, I chuckled a bit to myself for a couple of reasons. One is I think it's the shortest chapter I've ever written in anything ever. If it took you more than 10 minutes to read, I hope that meant that I wrote something confusing and you had to read over it. Because it's so very, very small. So I thought, I'm not sure I can fill an entire session on the smallest chapter I've ever written. But I also thought it was interesting because I remembered at the Willow Creek Association, which is where I was working, where we published that work, that we had this big debate of, did the chapter even need to be in there? Did it warrant its own chapter? Was it just like an aside to something else? And the woman who was the head of our publishing, who was also a dear friend, is a dear friend, and was in a small group with me, and we'd been journeying on these themes for quite some time. If I recall correctly, she was the one that said, it doesn't matter that it's short. I think this is a vitally important point that we need to call out. And, however long it is, it doesn't matter. So I actually like that, when Mike was, and you, Kathy, I'm sure were part of the conversation, what should we do? How do we want to do this? What's the best use of time? I think the ideas in the chapter are relatively simple, and I can, bring some. Mike asked me to think about any additional stories I could share, and I have a couple in mind that I'm happy to do so. But I'm assuming all of you are part of this cohort or decided to be part of this, whatever we're calling this webinar today, because you actually agree and share a deep passion for the role of shepherding in the body of Christ and why that's so vitally important. My friend Nancy, the publisher at the association, she said, Mindy, this might be one of the most important things we're actually saying in the whole book, is calling to whomever might read this, but attempting to call the church back to this central and often maligned area of ministry. Maligned is maybe too strong, but you know what I mean. Perhaps when in ministry settings, like shepherding is like that thing that other people have to do, not what pastors and leaders do. I'm wondering if anyone else, like maybe, and I don't mind if you unmute for a minute, has anyone else felt that tension in church leadership circles where shepherding is kind of seen as a bit of a lesser gift or a lesser priority? I mean, no one would say that outright, but has anyone else felt that tension in a ministry context? Any kind of feedback? Have you guys sensed that at ever? I'm seeing heads nod. Maybe that's the most efficient way to get feedback from you guys. I had a pastor one time tell me he didn't have a mercy gift. Yeah. I thought that was kind of scary. Yeah. And there are, I suppose, certain spiritual gifts that are generally not connected to one another and don't tend to ride. But you're right. It seems that something so inherently close to the heart of God, we would want to be very careful of saying whether or not we think it is important in the local church's ministry. So for me, I think the reason this became important is because the more I got into this intersection between leadership development or church leadership and systems and structures and strategies and the care of the soul and how are people being formed into the image of Christ, and isn't that the central purpose of discipleship, and isn't discipleship somehow the central purpose of the church, and therefore isn't that the central goal of church leaders? I found that all this rhetoric and theory about how org structures were working and how leadership needed to function in a church was seeming more and more disconnected from something that I was seeing actually was more and more close to our purpose as the church and as leaders, vocational or otherwise, within the church. And so it's become an increasing tension for me. Even now, one of the things I can share in this season of my life is I'm on a leadership team. I'm a volunteer at a church plant. It's about 3 years old here in Louisville, Colorado. And now no longer as a staff member, but as a volunteer who works very closely with the pastors, I remain in a place that stays very in touch with the pressures they're facing every week. Do we have enough volunteers for the children's ministry? Is this sermon series resonating with our congregation? Should we move to 2 services or stay at 1? Should we do a new building campaign? We can't stay in a rented garage essentially forever. Those are the very practical demands that most Western church leaders are having to deal with. And they're not insignificant. I can't look at our co-pastors and say, oh, well, that's just not spiritual. You shouldn't be concerned about those things. That's ridiculous. They are being good stewards of the community that they're trying to shape. But at the same time, I'm aware that week to week, without intentional effort, it's possible to lose sight of this central goal of how exactly are people who are getting involved in this community in any way being cared for, shepherded in a way that would allow for their souls to be formed, allow for discipleship vision to be cast and next steps to be taken. And so I think my heart in this particular chapter 4, and this was my fear in putting that Ezekiel passage in there, and we even wondered, should we do a Lectio on that? And I'm like, no. Kathy, I didn't get the chance to tell you this, but I mean, one time when this was starting to get really, really angsty in me, that's what my teenagers call it, when it was getting very angsty, and like, this has to matter. This can't be optional. This can't be like relegated to some other team of people. This is the central purpose of the church. Shepherding is kind of a big deal to God. And I remember seeing that passage and others like it. There's at least one or two others that we hear that same outcry really by God, that like his own people, his leaders are not caring for the flock. There's strays that are not being brought back. There are lost people who are not being found. There are young ones who are not getting fed. There's all these different things, and it actually matters quite a bit to God. He's not above shepherding. It matters quite a lot to him that these things get cared for. Anyway, in my angst, I decided the next time I was with a group of pastors, I was going to read through that passage. Have any of you done that? Have you ever read that passage out loud to a group of pastors? I almost could not choke my way through it. It was so painful. It is searing in its accusation. It is straight to, I mean, it could have been written about us today in terms of those who, and anyone who's been in, I probably think almost anyone who's ever been in vocational leadership has at some point on some bad day been one of those leaders. So let's not just say it's only those people. It's like, and me and whatever. How are my personal anything being advanced by the service I'm doing, right? Like that's essentially what's going on. And God, I don't remember if I wrote this in the chapter or not. I should have double checked this before I'm saying it. But I remember thinking the truest way of saying this is God is like hacked off. He is pissed off. This is God angry. This is like, I entrusted you with the care of my people, and it's not okay. It's not okay that it's going this way. And when I discovered what that felt like to read that aloud with us was when I thought, this is a very unusual. Okay, so I see a good point coming in here. Surprised to hear that some pastors don't see shepherding as a significant part of their job. This may be a reflection of the fact that I've been in so many larger church contexts. And so I'll admit that there are many traditions and entire systems of churches who would not identify with this, and praise be to God that that's the case. What I find is that everyone would align with the language of it. Of course, we know the word pastor means shepherd, right? So at a surface, at a certain level, that priority is seen as their job. When you look at the things that God was saying would be evidence of them actually doing that job, that's where I see there's a bit of a rub. So are lost people being found? Are new ones being fed? Are lame ones being healed? And is the church a place where more often than not, that is the result of people's involvement under that kind of shepherding? That's where I think it's a little different from what we're saying we do and what's actually happening. Now, and again, sometimes I think we get super, super negative on the body of Christ and on church leadership. And I see some other comments in there. I'll come and look at those in a sec. You know, there's the research from Reveal and the Reveal leaders would say that a lot of times we're harder on ourselves as leaders than is actually what the experience of many people in congregations is. And I think we have very high ideals, and we want to make sure we move towards them. And I think there are things that are areas of error that warrant correction, or at least, of course, you know, movement. Many people are being shepherded in churches, are finding life. But I've also seen a lot of cases where people are coming to a church hoping for those things and not finding them. They're finding other things, but they're not finding that deep longing of their hearts. Now, you could say they are resisting it at some level, which very well could be true. But I don't find, somebody said something about leadership. I'll get to that in a sec. But I think we spend a lot more time talking about leadership than we do shepherding. And again, not to get into a debate around semantics, it's about what is the fruit of that leadership. Is the fruit of that leadership that we're creating an environment where those things that God seems to define as effective leadership that is shepherding are happening? Then great, then we're all on the same page. But where there are misses in those functions of a community that is being well shepherded, those are the things that I think cause us to start saying, how should we be doing this a little differently? So let me check this. Okay, among pastors, the message that shepherding is small and ranching is big. Yeah, so that's everywhere still, is according to Ken. Raise your hand, Ken. Where's Ken? Thank you. Appreciate that. A lot of leadership for pastors means drawing from the world of business for models. Yes. And that was another thing I was actually mentioning. I don't know if you caught that in the chapter. That's a good way to start a really feisty debate among a lot of church leaders, is whether or not we should be drawing insights from the world or business. And, you know, there's so many different ways to look at that. You know, there's the all truth is God's truth. And if it's a good wisdom, we should try to figure out how to use it and benefit from it. And then there's the other side that says, if it's only concerned with increasing bottom line and profitability, that's not our goal, so we shouldn't use that. Not here to necessarily have that debate, but what I find interesting is the debate about our source of information a little bit turns the conversation away from what is the goal we're trying to get to. And that's what I'm hoping chapter 4 gets us to, is whatever our path to get to making sure that congregations, communities are being shepherded in the way that God sees, such that those outcomes, it sounds very businessy, but those outcomes are in place, that lost are found, people are fed, young are nurtured, healing is happening, however our community is defining that. Those are the things that I'd like to have the conversation be centered around. How is what God is defining as shepherding, how is that happening? All right, I'm going to keep going on some of these. I feel like I should be letting you guys unmute so you can just raise your hand. But tension between managing the administrative details of the programs under my care, oh my goodness, and attending to the spiritual welfare of our congregation. Yeah, I just talked to one woman who's leading the administration of our church on Sunday, and I can just see the fatigue in her eyes. And honestly, I'm less worried about the people under her care right now. I'm more worried about her. And that was one of the other things that I mentioned in that chapter 4, is that everybody gets all riled up about what we're going to go do for Jesus. And we forget that we're still the ones under that shepherd, that good shepherd's care as well. And that's why I loved Kathy's suggestion for us to start with the 23rd Psalm, because that's 100% true for every one of us in the midst of our getting it right sometimes, getting it wrong sometimes. On any given day, we are yet still the ones who are under that good shepherd's care. And it matters for us to move into our days and weeks and responsibilities with that mindset. When we lose that, then we've almost lost all hope of staying on the right path, just because we've lost that interior solid foundation. And I'm not saying that like out of judgment. That is my story very intensely in one season of life, but it's a recurring theme, because on any given day, all of us can choose, are we leaning in or leaning out? Are we remaining connected, or are we kind of off on our own program? And that to me is the challenge, the biggest challenge for anyone involved in church ministry and church leadership, is to keep that deep life-giving connection to their own source of life, so that we have a shot of staying clear on the other things that are so important. So whoever wrote that, let's see, I lost your name, Rachel Young. Yes, care for your own soul, girl. It's only when it's out of the overflow of what's going on in you that the cascading of those living waters can go to others. It's only out of that overflow that you can actually care about the well-being of a congregation. Because if it's coming out of a sense of duty or responsibility, even if it is kind of like part of your job description, that can be so stifling. That burden is not easy, and that is not that is heavy. Yes, hand raised.
Could I add to that, Mindy, that I
do.
think part of the tension is between these details that I can hopefully cross my fingers that what I'm planning is going to affect people, but also knowing that most people grow in one-to-one or in smaller group relationships. So I can do all this work on programs and miss the whole point of the exercise, which is the spiritual welfare of our congregation. So I feel that tension between I've got to get this done versus am I really with people, and am I making time for people, and do I even have a sense of how I want people to move?
I love hearing that. Great question. I hope we are on the tail end of a highly programmatic vision of what it means to be a church. I think the data is out. Programs don't change people's lives, and we're sort of still somewhat obsessed with them. They have a role. They can have a very important strategic role in taking a huge congregation and giving people a clear next step of where they could fit in or take a next step to get connected. But if that is seen by the church leadership or any of us as the end, and that getting people to those programs is success, I think we do run a risk that we don't fulfill our role as shepherds to create environments where the actual shepherding is going to take place, which, as you said, is the one-on-one relationships, people being known, their stories are known, they are embraced as who they really are. All those dynamics that are necessary for actual life change can manifest. It's not going to happen in a 8-week class, but the 8-week class might be a very good way to help people then make the connections that get to that end. I don't know if you're familiar with the other, one of the other more church leadership books that I've done recently is called Stir, and it's spiritual transformation in relationships. And in it, I was laying out a framework that I hope has been helpful to some churches to start thinking about how people at different stages of development need different kinds of relational constructs for transformation, but they all need relationship. And that's one of my things with many churches where it gets too programmatic. And as an author and a content person, I think there's a part of the reason we get this way is we get really obsessed with the right ideas. Like, oh, it's about the right idea. If I can just communicate the right idea, that's going to bring transformation. Well, no. Right ideas are important. They're helpful. This probably sounds like complete heresy to any of you who are seminary people. But it's the relational context that opens the door for transformation most deeply. And that's part of the later chapters in Become. You would get to some of that. But anyway, I sympathize with that. I think the caring for your own soul in the midst of that recognizing the place program has, but not letting it derail the eventual goal is really important. And I think another thing I've learned from one friend of mine, I just had dinner with a pastor who was in from Texas. He's one of my favorites. Like, I've had this love of getting to know pastors all over the country. And he realized that his children, his whole staff team are really passionate about discipleship. Like, that's just part of their DNA. It's part of how they've been as a church. In fact, I think the end of Stir chapter was devoted to what they're doing and how they are as a church. But they're very, very discipleship focused people. Were having a hard time stepping into more administrative roles where, say, for example, this 27-year-old woman who's got 2 kids is leading the children's ministry, where she now has 300 volunteers, which is bigger than most churches, right? They're swamped with growth, and they're not marketing. They're not like trying to, rally people in. It's just God's moving, the Spirit's moving, great stuff is happening. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's like tearing this girl apart that she can't live out her vision of discipleship and what that should look like with, maybe it was 150, I don't remember, 150 volunteers. And it's like the pastors had to work really closely with her and that team to help set reasonable expectations. No, you're not discipling 150 volunteers. That's okay. You don't, but at the risk of I can't do everything, she was losing touch with just a few that she was actually walking deeply with. And they have found that to be one good, healthy way to balance that in their congregation is for each of their staff to stay true to their deepest heart around discipleship and really journeying with people in the deep and real places, but in a way that allows them to actually set some examples for others in the congregation to be doing the same, not that they are doing the direct shepherding of the 150 volunteers. And I don't know if that's helpful to you in your context, but yeah. All right, so let's see. Administration, size of the church, so much has to be done by deacons, student ministers, small group leaders. Are these enough? Are they always properly trained? Is that a rhetorical question? Well, thank God the Holy Spirit trains us when we're not trained. If we'll just listen and walk closely with Him. But of course, the issue of training is a big deal, and it can be a really wise way to look at what can feel like an overwhelming responsibility, and say, how, like, maybe you have a congregation of 80 people. Well, you're not going to be shepherding directly those 80 or 800, put however many zeros around it you want. You're not going to be directly. You could probably directly shepherd 8 people, right? Like, but the minute you start putting orders of magnitude on that, you have to start thinking, who am I equipping to help carry this vitally important function of the body? And so one of the things that our church is facing as a tension point, and I can just share it, we haven't fully resolved it, is to the question of program. Like, we're trying to figure out, okay, how do we help new people get involved in something that gets them known and opportunities to meet other people? All that's really good. But there's a part of me that's wondering, should we be also doing something where we're asking people who have some sort of willingness to mentor, lead, do something, and actually putting a focused bit of effort into their lives so that we're sort of increasing the values around discipleship in the whole congregation, rather than only creating like pipelines of like people that need to walk through a path, if that makes any sense. And so we're still in the middle of that wrestling right now. My hunch is that if we, out of our church, could find 50 people who would raise their hands and do a 2-month journey with us around shepherding, I mean, whatever language you want to put around it, like how to care for people in their spiritual development at any stage, I think that would be a really cool thing to see happen more and more, rather than simply inviting people to a new topical study. Anyway, that's our current current dilemma. Countercultural, yes. Somewhat subversive to the dominant leadership. Question, what is your advice on the conflicts that come from a commitment to shepherding souls of others? Whoever said that, Pete, can you restate that question about that conflict so that I can get a better sense? Yeah.
Just in let's say people have expectations of your leadership. You're going to do stuff, but you get caught maintaining boundaries that don't do stuff, but they're doing important things in the shepherding role. So obviously it's a conflict. You could describe any particular situation. It's going to be different, I know, but I don't know, maybe you can say something about holding that within us in a healthy way without just imploding.
Yes. Well, first of all, no imploding. There's no, how is that ever good? Whoever wins, exactly. Right? So not that you would suggest that, but sometimes we have to say the obvious because it is so countercultural. Because nobody wins. Nobody wins when somebody goes down. That's just kind of like, we see it so clearly, like, you would never keep flying an airplane that you knew had no fuel left. Like, that's just dumb. But we continue to tap the resources, and they're not inexhaustible, especially when we run into rhythms of life that draw us away from God as our source. Not that anybody means it, but when you're running 24 hours a day and trying to manage your own family life and everything else, it's not doable. And we need to say that. The word that was coming to mind as you spoke was the word of negotiation. And I actually am learning a lot more about that in my current work here, that expectations need to be negotiated. And especially when we're changing paradigms, part of our negotiation, it's not like a animosity. It's not a, what's the word I want? Anyway.
Confrontation?
Yeah, it doesn't have to be adversarial in terms of the negotiation. And I think we could come to even see it as a teaching point, not to be dismissive or insulting to anyone. It's more like a teaching of a new way of thinking, and whatever resources help you to make those points with wise people who really do care about the outcomes eventually, that renegotiation of expectations seems to be super important. And there's two negotiations I'm hearing you mention. One is the negotiation of how much am I caring for my own soul versus what am I doing to advance the work of the job I'm hired to do. Okay, so that you got to tease that's one important negotiation, and we can talk about that. The other one I'm hearing you say is, what is the negotiation that needs to surround if I, as a church leader, am choosing to spend 10, 15, 20 hours of my week caring for the souls of others, maybe building into my staff, building into my leadership team, building into any number of things. And if anyone is in disagreement, to whom you're accountable, because we're all accountable to somebody, and anyone is in disagreement that that's the best way for you to use your limited time caring for the souls of others, that is a related but separate question. And I think similar arcs of logic apply to both. But the first one, in my view, is easier than the second because it just is not workable otherwise. And so that that way of life for you or for any of us to live, I've started calling it, I gave a talk at a church out in California a year and a half ago. And the best part of it was that I got to call it the rebellion. And I really do feel like we have to take on the mindset of a bit of a rebel if we're going to get to the point where we are feisty and refusing to lead God's people in a way that kills our own soul. We just can't. And you shouldn't need anyone's permission for that. But you may need to negotiate it. If there are sets of expectations around how you spend your time or what your priorities are, we still need to figure out how that is. We're still accountable for getting the thing we're hired to do done. But people may have certain ideas about how you spend your time in order to get that done. And that is a point of negotiation, as I would see it. I was just talking to a group of leaders here, a week and a half ago. We had some folks from Hillsong out here and a group called Thrivent, and it was a great meeting. And I just had the chance to share some of my own story, which Kathy has alluded to. I remember I was turning to our CEO at some point, and I was like, yeah, it turns out that whole idea of streams of living waters is actually real. Who knew? People in ministry are not exactly believing that because we teach it, but we've lost sight of the fact that maybe that could apply to us as well, or we've lost hope that it could. And, I don't want to press in on something that maybe you guys have already been journeying on, you're already persuaded on. But I do not think that when Jesus said we needed to count the cost in order to follow him, that one of the costs that we were supposed to count, I do not think, was an ever diminishing interior life with God. That's just like, it's so illogical. And if you were the enemy and God were rallying people to his purposes, it'd make a lot of sense to cut him off at the knees. Have I heard of slow church? Yeah, I have. Yeah. Yeah, are not designed to build that way. Yeah. Yeah, I haven't read it, but I've heard really good things about it. And I think there's probably 300 ways, maybe 3,000, maybe as individuals, every single pastor there is out there are ways to approach the shepherding of your congregation. And if you can learn from other people who wrote books and did things, then by all means do. But however we, in our context, in the community of our leaders who are sitting around praying about our people, are being led to take next steps toward that, that is a good thing. One of the things I'm learning at the work environment I'm in right now is a much more iterative environment where we try things and we learn and we shift and we move and we adapt. And I think in the church world, we try to get it right. We so want it right. And I think sometimes like a mediocre idea that we just start acting on and learn from as we go is actually not a bad thing, which makes me sound like I'm like advocating a less than intense path. But I have also sat in too many meeting rooms with whiteboard conversations with lots of circles and arrows and lines and a lot of other stuff never gets happening because we're trying to get a perfect paradigm or a perfect framework. And I don't think there's a perfect framework. I think there's a local community with personalities who are involved in leading, and they have strengths and weaknesses, and just trying and getting out in front of something and willingness to learn is probably the most important thing. All right, I'm going to be quiet for a minute. Kathy, am I supposed to be like asking people to raise their hands now, or should I keep reading through these things? I think we only have like 7 minutes left. I want to make sure I'm making good use of everyone's time.
Yeah, no, I think that either way is fine. I think as long as people get their questions out there, feel free to unmute and ask, and yeah.
I would love a recipe for the ways to help big churches effectively generate caring and shepherding with the flock. Oh, yes, recipes. Laura, where are you? Yes, love it. Is there more you want to say about that particular question?
Tim, were you raising your hand a minute ago?
Yeah. Sorry, I couldn't unmute.
Tim, hold on just a second. I want to hear what Laura's question is, but hold yours. We'll get to it.
That is a reflection of, I love what you're saying, and my deep embracing of this reality that that's the most important thing. And I am serving at a church with over 1,000 members as a director of adult discipleship, going, shoot, because I've never been a part of this big of a church before. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, I just keep reaching for and looking for and watching for those moments. And so that's just an expression of validation of what you're saying and longing. And in reality, it's in part knowing your stuff, doing things like this, and then faith that God's at work and it's not all on our shoulders.
Yeah.
Because I would just shrivel up and go away. It requires faith. And anyway, thank you for this.
Yeah, for sure. If I could just say one more thing to Laura before we turn to Tim. One of the things that actually the prayer team at Willow Creek made me do lovingly, and then I abandoned for many years wrongly, and have returned it to at different stages in different ways, is actually pulling together a group of intercessors over whatever your work is, whether you're a senior pastor on the staff of a church, whatever it is. If we really believe, and I know we all do, that we are operating in a fundamentally spiritual reality where the unseen is more of determinative of what happens than anything we say in meetings or decide to do, it really stands to reason that we would wisely, and that's a big caveat, but wisely tap into those who are called to be intercessors, because it's just too big a job. It's too big a task. There are too many variables. There's too much unknown. Nobody's smart enough to figure this out. And there is no figuring it out per se that is universal. There's the specific thing with your pastor and your volunteers and your actual physical community that you're in. And so the discernment required, the breaking free of things in the unseen realm is so important. If I could give every single person who's listening to this one homework assignment, if you don't already have one, pull together. It could be your mother and your best friend from college, or it could be, and I'm a fan of mothers who pray. Or it could be a select group of people that are trustworthy, that are your close-knit friends. They could be part of your community or completely far away. It doesn't matter. You can let them know who each other is. You can blind copy them on every email. There's so many ways to do this, but I have seen it's almost impossible for me to overstate how much of a dramatic change I've seen in my life and in other people's lives when like a hockey stick moment, like when they rallied and really experienced themselves as dependent on the activity of God and rallied some intercessors to that along the path. There are plenty of ways that can go south and ways that it could be unwise. If you want to follow up on that, maybe Kathy and I can put something together that would be helpful to you. But our adversary is not our boards or the pastor that doesn't get it or whatever else. Those are not the real barriers to what's going on here. I know you know that, but sometimes we can forget it in the midst of it. And God has made a way for us to ask. You did recruit intercessor prayer team women's retreat? Yeah, no doubt. It's cool. It's really fun. It's kind of fun. All right. So Tim, you had something you had for us.
Yes. Thank you. This came from one of your other chapters of the book, but those shifts shift from transaction to process, individualism to community. The third one, you've kind of been talking about some of it already, but performance to incarnational ministry. I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit. Or is that too hard?
Yeah, it is kind of related to that, because I think at the core of it is the question of, what am I depending on for success? Am I depending on my performance or other people's? Or am I depending on the presence of a living God among us? And there, I just looked back at the page. I'd probably have to go back to it to see more of what had been on my mind at that time, but that's the first thing that comes to mind. Yeah, so that in Corinthians, the verse about now to each one a manifestation of the Spirit is given, the description of spiritual gifts there. I think I'd been in environments, and this probably wasn't what anyone ever actually meant, but what it felt like to me was like, if you had a gift of leadership, you know, you would be handed that gift of leadership like this. Now I have a gift of leadership and I can go bludgeon anyone I want with it because I have the gift of leadership, and you better follow me because I have this gift of leadership. Can't you see it? And again, no one would have outright said it that way, but I found that way of thinking of spiritual gifts as something I had been given and it was my job to go do something with was very different than this one passage in Corinthians that's showing a more connected to God manifestation of spiritual gifts, which is about, well, what is my day-to-day moment connection with God such that his Spirit could manifest through my life? I mean, that's a big spiritual word, manifest, right? But like this idea that I'm not just performing, that's a very human-centric, me and my sets of skills, energy, talent, drive, whatever, which activates a whole other set of things for me, versus I step into service from a posture of connection with God that allows who knows what to happen through God's Spirit manifesting. And it is a very big shift, I think. Most church environments are very stuck in a high performance mentality, and even our structures, the way we physically arrange ourselves for a worship service, reinforce that idea of performers and observers. And pushing against that in meaningful ways, I think, is a worthy concept. There's one church that I don't know if I wrote about this in the book, but one of the church and I see we're over our hour. Sorry, I'll be quick. In Nashville, that Michael Card, some of you guys from the 80s might remember Michael Card. He was the guest singer at a church planners boot camp that my husband and I went to in the early 90s. And he brought some of the leaders from his church and told a really cool story of like how he submitted all of his lyrics before publishing anything into music to his elder team. And they reviewed, and he felt himself to be as an artist in submission to his church leaders, which I thought was cool. But one of the stories they shared was that they recognized that it was a difficult environment in Nashville for their worship leaders to be every week singing, leading worship in front of the entire recording industry, right? How do they every week try to lead others in the worship of God when they are singing, playing, transitioning, everything in front of the executives of the recording industry? And rather than make their worship artists feeling bad about that, they almost like named the tension, said, hey, this is something that's probably hard, and then decided to change the job title of the worship leader from worship leader to lead worshiper. Subtle little difference, not that big a deal in some ways. But the result of that was that it helped get away from this performance mentality. And, I'm not saying it solved it entirely. I don't know what the equivalent would be like in other settings, but I find it's very difficult to get away from that because it's so sort of Western mindset. I can't speak for other parts of the world, but most of the places I've traveled internationally that are still a bit of a Western mindset, this is a big issue. It's always there. And again, if you were the enemy, how could you best thwart God's purposes? Get his people depending on their own strength. Kathy, lead us home.
Yeah. Mindy, thank you so much. And thank you to everybody else that got on today and participated. And this is one of the things I always go back to, something Rachel tells us all the time. It's just good to know you're not alone in this. And there's people around to maybe not solve the problem, but to name it and to think about it together and pray about it together and support one another, and being able to go back and say, hey, let's work on this. So, yeah. Mindy, thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, you're welcome.
Really.
I don't know if we have a plan to close, but do you mind if I just pray everybody before?
I would love that. I would love that.
I would love it. All right, guys, let's just take a moment and quiet our hearts. God, I fear running the risk ever of speaking of things that are so close to your heart in any flippant or quick or trite way. This is about your purposes in our world. This is about the work of your body still doing what you came to do in fulfillment of Isaiah 61. We get to be part of how you are releasing people from bondage and setting the captives free, and release of darkness for the blind. And so God, for those who've been here with us over this last hour, you know the details of the weariness in their own hearts. You know the details of struggles that their families may be going through. You know the high hopes they have for seeing a movement of your Spirit in their local context. And God, I pray that just even as we're together right now, they could just quietly lay each of those things before you. That we can trust ourselves to your good care. To remember once again that you are our good shepherd, that you don't expect things of us that are beyond what you expect of us. Maybe other people do, or even we ourselves expect things, but you are a gentle and loving shepherd. For those who need some still waters and some quiet places, God, I pray that you would provide that soon. For those who need to know that your hand is with them, even in a dark valley, I pray that they would sense that as well. For those who need protection in the midst of some enemy territory, God, would you move powerfully, that they would even rest and enjoy a banquet, fundamentally at peace, even in the midst of opposition. And God, would you, through our efforts and the efforts of so many others around the world, continue to draw your people to yourself. Help us to know how to work well with each other toward that end. And God, help us to do this in your strength and not our own. For your glory. Amen. Alrighty, friends. Thanks for the joy of hearing a little bit of your stories. You're doing great things. It's a good path. Bye, Kathy.
Bye. Y'all have a great afternoon.